Hello and welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started on our webinar today. I'm Lynette Attai. I am Project Director for COSIN's Privacy Initiative and Trusted Learning Environment Program. I'm really pleased to be here with Ross Lemke, who manages the U.S. Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center. And we are going to talk today about FERPA, what districts are commonly getting wrong or commonly have questions about with respect to FERPA, and hopefully leave you with some tips and guidance for ensuring that you avoid common missteps. So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction. As I mentioned, I'm Project Director for COSIN's Student Data Privacy Initiative and Trusted Learning Environment Program. I am a privacy consultant. I've been working in data privacy for about 20 or so years with special expertise in youth and education data privacy. I am really excited to be joined by Ross Lemke. Ross, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the work that you do at PTAC?
Sure, absolutely. So, thank you for having me on this webinar. I'm really excited to, just kind of have informal talk about FERPA and all the problems that we see. My name is Ross Lemke. I've been working on PTAC for over 10 years now. I've been in the education data space for about 20 years. And I've been running PTAC for about 5 years now. So a lot of what we do is we provide direct technical assistance to IHEs, state education agencies, local education agencies, through a number of avenues. We come up with best practice resources, we go to conferences, we go on site and meet with people, sometimes all of the above, regional meetings. But honestly, like probably the most important thing we do is we operate the Student Privacy Help Desk. FERPA's hard. What I tell my audiences typically is I don't expect you to remember all of this. I don't expect you to remember half of this. My hope is that you remember that this is hard and there is a resource that you can go to ask for help. So our Student Privacy Help Desk will have the numbers and the email address, but this is something where if you call, you will talk to a human being. Usually, sometimes all the human beings are in a meeting, like most of you, and it will go to voicemail, but we will call you back. That's important to us because typically what we see is when somebody emails a question to us, sometimes your question isn't the real question that you have, and we just kind of need to go and talk it out and get to the bottom of what you do. So, but before I worked on PTAC, like I said, I worked on a variety of education data collections, EdFacts, civil rights data collection. I know this is a LEA audience. That collection is open now. Usually, if it's LEA audience, I hear an audible groan out of the audience for that. That's okay. Most of my gray and missing hair can be attributed to the civil rights data collection. I've also worked with IDA as well, so which creates some interesting times in my school because I do have a kid on an IEP, and I have worked with lots of people at the U.S. Department of Education on special education. So when I'm not doing all that, I do the typical stuff. I travel. I work. Spend time with family, and yes, I coach rugby. Not
I
that I ever
coach.
played rugby or anything like that, but my daughter saw her two elder brothers play, and she wanted to, she wanted to play too. The only way she could play is if Dad volunteered to coach.
Well, I think the important note there, Ross, is that you coach kindergartners on rugby, and I think at some point we should do a whole webinar just unpacking that.
2019 state champions. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we are thrilled to have you here, and we are going to talk about one of Ross's and my favorite topics, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. As Ross mentioned, FERPA is hard. And as I often say, when it comes to data privacy, if it's hard, you're probably doing it right. So before we dig into the questions about where people are most challenged when it comes to FERPA and what some of the murkier areas of FERPA are that we need to unpack, I thought it would be helpful to just level set by taking a step back and from a very high level, just walking through briefly, what is FERPA about? Because it's easy to say, oh, it's a privacy regulation, but it's really a few things. And I think it helps to remember the time when FERPA was drafted, which is within the Watergate era. And there was tremendous mistrust of government entities. And what FERPA was really designed to do was to provide transparency to parents and students about what was happening with student data in schools. What data were schools collecting? What were they doing with it? And to really sort of open the doors, if you will, provide transparency to the community to build more trust in the state agency and the government agency that was doing all this work for their students. So using that as our foundation, I think helps to explain a lot of what is required under FERPA. Doesn't make it easier, but it kind of helps to explain the framework under which FERPA sits. FERPA establishes rights for parents and students who are age 18 and older or have enrolled in an institution of higher education to provide them with access to the student's education record, to that information, including the personally identifiable information that an education institution that is covered under FERPA is collecting about students and recording about an individual student. With a few exceptions, because FERPA is nothing if not a little bit complicated in each piece of the law, but ensuring that primarily that parents and eligible students have rights to access the student's education record, and to request corrections in errors in the education record, not grades, but errors in fact, errors particularly as relates to the personal information, to request to amend those records, and of course, that extends to records that are held not just by the education institution, but by the education institution's partners, including their technology providers. FERPA, perhaps not intentionally, but certainly in design, FERPA provides a certain balance. Because on the one hand, FERPA requires that the education institution be obtaining the consent from the parent or eligible student before disclosing the student's personal information. But at the same time, FERPA also recognizes that education institutions have to function in certain ways, and they're required to function in certain ways. And so FERPA allows for certain exceptions to that rule of requiring consent. And it's some of those exceptions that we're going to touch on a little bit later on, certainly in some of the thornier areas. Ross, anything you'd like to add to that or correct?
Well, I love that you bring up the historical aspect of this. I've actually, it's not in my bio, but I do have 2 history degrees. So I do sort of appreciate the time that the country lived in when FERPA was enacted. But it was also enacted, you see the roots of a lot of other sectoral privacy laws in the country, all kind of based on these fair information, practices that, I mean, it's fundamental, like, what do you have on me? Like, let me fix that, fix problems. And I want to have some control over who gets that information. I think one of those, the interesting things about FERPA though is that it's a public education law, so it only applies to schools that are receiving funds from the U.S. Department of Education. So this is something that we see a lot because we have a lot of students or parents that choose to send their children to private schools. They collect and maintain information as well, but one of the appeals of a private school is getting outside of the big monolithic structure of public education. The downside of that is that it takes you away from some of the federal protections afforded by that big monolithic public education. So it's kind of a two-edged sword there, and it's sad that when we have to talk to some of those parents that this horrible thing happened and there's nothing that's the U.S. Department of Education can do about.
Yeah, great point. I would certainly say from COSIN perspective, from my perspective, looking at the fair information practice principles that Ross alluded to, these were also written in the 1970s when FERPA was also born. And whether intentionally or not, they form the underpinnings for just about every privacy law that we see written. So when all else fails around privacy, I often encourage people to lean back on the fair information practice principles because those fundamental concepts will ring true across all privacy laws. And whether you are in a school system that is covered under FERPA or not, encourage you to leverage those principles as foundational to building your privacy program. You cannot go wrong when you look at the fair information practice principles, and they exist in different, slightly different iterations, but they all, you will find different versions of the fair information practice principles, but they all share common ground. And whichever version you pick up, you will be in a good place when it comes to privacy. So, starting our tiptoe into the weeds a little bit here, I know that for many districts, one of the key concerns, and certainly for many parents, one of the key concerns is school districts sharing student personal information with technology providers and with, let's not forget, community service organizations. And so many of these organizations fall under an exception to the FERPA requirement that parental consent be obtained before sharing that information. But there are a number of limitations to that exception. There are a number of conditions that need to be met in order to leverage that exception, and there are a number of safeguards that are built into that exception. It is not a free-for-all. And Ross, I'm wondering if you could just talk us through what are the requirements for this exception, which we refer to as the school official.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Well, let's just take a step back a little bit. So working with vendors are just another type of school official. So the school official exception is one of the one of the exceptions to the consent requirement that permits, keyword there's permits, a school to disclose information to a party that has is designated as a school official by the district and has a legitimate educational interest in accessing that information. So we get a common question that we get is that, is this software FERPA compliant? There is no such thing as a FERPA compliant piece of software. There is, I would consider FERPA friendly pieces of software, but typically we hear from vendors all the time, like, oh, well, you can use our product. We're school officials. Drives me nuts because they don't get to decide that. So the designation of what constitutes a school official is largely a local thing. So, your school district, if you're a charter school, you probably count as a school district anyways, you're going to have an annual notice of FERPA rights. And that annual notice of FERPA rights, amongst other things, aside from detailing, here's your right to inspect, here's how you exercise that right, here's how you request amendment, here's how you file a complaint, here's how we designate a school official, and here's the categories, like, teachers, administrators. We could get really, really granular there, or we could be very, very broad. And, FERPA doesn't tell you how to do it. But at the end of the day, that first check about whether you can share an information to a vendor or not is, does it fit the definition of a school official as is listed in your annual notice of FERPA rights? So if you have an annual notice of FERPA rights that was written in 1980 and you just never updated it, I would be strongly concerned about whether the data sharing that you're doing with ed tech providers is even appropriate. Because have you put vendors there? Now, you don't have to go specifically say that, XYZ software provider is my school official. You can, but then that becomes an administrative burden. But just having it, broad enough so that if, a reasonable person looks at it like, oh yeah, that counts. So that's the first part of it. You have to fit the definition of a school official. If that vendor does not fit the definition of a school official, you cannot use the school official exception and you will need to get consent. Good luck with that. Although consent sometimes is a best practice as well. My school district, there's a set of applications that they just use the school official exception for, and then there's like a subset that, not everybody needs this, is not totally required, but it would be nice. They get consent for that. So I'm gonna actually give my school district some credit for that one. Lynette and I have talked many times about what my school district does. They largely don't know what I do for a living, which is probably a good thing. So outside of school being listed as a school official, you need to have a legitimate educational interest in accessing that information. So, I need to know something to do my job or function. So let's take vendors out of it for a moment. So I'm a school. Say I have a student with a life-threatening peanut allergy. Who needs to know that information from that student's education record? Well, clearly the teacher should know about that in case the kid has a Snickers bar during class. She needs to know to provide the appropriate level of care for the child. Well, you know what? The cafeteria staff clearly needs to know that. They need to make sure that that student doesn't, inadvertently consume peanuts in the cafeteria. You know what? Actually, this allergy is so severe that seconds matter if he's exposed to peanuts. We are going to go, and we've determined that every educator in the school needs to know about this because it's just that serious. Okay, that's a thoughtful way of doing it. Now, you can outsource the function of a school official, provided that you're doing something you'd otherwise use your own employees for. So if you had enough employees, you'd have enough people to go on the field trip, but you don't. So you have parent volunteers come in. So say I'm chaperoning the field trip, they could tell me that the student has a life-threatening peanut allergy if that student was in my care. Now, I couldn't redisclose that. I couldn't go run to the bus stop and talk about it, which by the way, we have a video on our website for parent volunteers. So if you haven't looked at it, you should link to it. That video largely exists because of things that my wife heard at the bus stop. Parents in my neighborhood have two hobbies. They like to volunteer in school and they like to gossip. Not good things. But let's take this up a level and talk about, disclosing to a vendor. So what is that legitimate educational interest? So I'm giving you this PII so you can handle our bus transportation system. So what do they really need to have to provide that, service? Typically, a lot of times, some vendors will just ask for everything. That exposes you to probably more risk than you need to accept. So, this third bullet point here, minimize data sharing. Only give them the data that they need to provide that service on your behalf. And yes, you need to have the records of disclosure, and you need to exert direct control. So direct control is kind of a funny thing. How do you exert direct control? If I'm a parent volunteer stuffing the Wednesday envelopes, maybe just sitting with me as I stuff the Wednesday envelopes, or maybe they're having me sign an agreement that's going to list how I interact with these records. Primarily in the world of ed tech, we're looking at some sort of contract, terms of service, written agreements. We have a great resource that was written in 2013, and I know that sounds really old, but FERPA was last regulated in 2011, so it's still current. So it's called Protecting Student Privacy While Using Online Educational Resources. That is quite a mouthful. I acknowledge that, but it sets the ground rules. Here's how you do it. Here's what's acceptable. Here's what's not acceptable. And the whole direct control thing. So, these agreements that you have with the vendor, one, keep in mind that, if they've given you a terms of service agreement, likely that thing exists to protect them, not you. The thing is, you don't have to sign that terms of service. You have some amount of ability to negotiate and have input in that, which is why we feel it is a best practice for you as a school district to have some sort of process in place to vet ed tech, vet these terms of service to make sure that they are acceptable with all appropriate state and federal privacy laws, and just even acceptable for what the expectations for your organization are. This stuff is hard, and keeping I'll ask an audience who here knows all the pieces of software that are in use in your school district. Nobody raises their hand. Well, maybe somebody raises their hand, but usually that person is lying. So I would absolutely because the thing is, a lot of these pieces of software, it's click next accept, and you may have signed yourself up for a FERPA issue. So you need to have some level of control over things.
So Ross, this has been a lot of great information, and I'm going to try to recap and provide a few tips and maybe some action points for our listeners. One, this is a pet peeve for you and I both. There is no such thing as a technology provider or any service provider saying that they are compliant with FERPA. They're just not a covered entity under the law. The education institution that receives funding from U.S. Department of Education is a covered entity under FERPA and is responsible for compliance with FERPA. Your vendors may be responsible for compliance with COPPA. There is no such thing as an education institution being compliant with COPPA. It doesn't mean that the parties don't have responsibilities under each law that they can take on if they're designated in a certain way, and can, not must. For example, if you designate a vendor as a school official, there are certain requirements on that school official that they take on, so they can align with the requirements that you have assigned to them, that apply to them. But if your contract says, "Hey, vendor, you agree to comply with FERPA," that doesn't actually mean much in contract language. Similar to saying, "Hey, company, you agree to comply with our district policies." Well, your district policies cover everything from data privacy to staff time off to how to handle bathroom breaks with students. So being very specific about your requirements and understanding that if a vendor comes to you and says, "We're FERPA compliant," they're either trying to be cute with their marketing, or they may not necessarily understand their obligations under FERPA. And so it's something to dig into. Second is, the vendor doesn't tell you that you're a school official. They ask you to designate them as a school official, and you make that determination, yes or no, based on what you've defined as your legitimate interests. So a vendor who says, "We're a school official," well, it depends. Have you been designated a school official by each district that you serve or not? The other thing that I'm hearing in here that I think is really important is your employees are also school officials. And so the requirements of minimizing data access, minimizing data sharing, maintaining records of disclosure, those apply for your employees too. So it means your teachers don't necessarily get access to all the data, just the data that they need in order to perform their job, which maybe, in the example that Ross gave us, may include certain health information. Do minimize the data sharing. Be very clear in your agreements what data you intend to share with your service providers, with your community organizations, with your technology providers. You can't sort of define the data that needs to be protected if you don't actually know what data is being shared. And then an important note is, with the question of whether or not you're going to rely on the school official's exception or rely on consent from parents, remember that if you are mandating the use of a certain technology product, and you've decided that that technology product can't actually be used in compliance with FERPA, doesn't actually align with the FERPA requirements, you can't actually compel the use of that product in your district, even if a parent says it's okay. You're responsible for ensuring that the technology that you bring in, the service providers that you use, can meet your requirements under FERPA. And if they can't, you need to consider, there's not really an out clause for that, okay? Especially if you're going to compel the use of that software. Anything else that I missed there, Ross?
No, it's great. I mean, continues to be a hot button issue. Literally, the phone call I was on before this was talking with somebody about ed tech and how it applies. Luckily, the call went pretty easy because it was a pretty complicated question, but like, wait a minute, you're not a school. You're just a private person, collecting information on people that you're helping. FERPA doesn't care. So, but one thing I would add though is, since these vendors are acting as your agents, if they do something wrong or something inappropriate, guess whose FERPA violation it is?
That's right.
It's
That's right.
yours.
It's the education
Congratulations.
institution's violation. And the repercussions for those violations can have pass-through effects to the vendor. But the actual penalty, if one is imposed on the education institution. It just kind of passes through to the vendor when the education institution, if they're in a situation where they're not able to share data with that provider for at least 5 years, that obviously has an incredibly detrimental and chilling effect on that vendor's lifeblood. Um, but it is important to note that the repercussions go to you first, and the backlash might go to your vendor. Interestingly enough, so two things here also. I want to mention that when it comes to working with vendors, Pearson has a student data privacy toolkit. It's cut up into 3 parts. Part 1 is really background information on privacy laws, on key privacy laws. Part 2 is specific to working with technology providers, vetting technology providers, understanding contracts, reviewing privacy policies. And so I encourage you, and then part 3 is around trust and transparency, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So I encourage you to visit cosin.org/privacy for some resources that can help you sort of take this conversation and move forward, in addition to the resources that are provided by PTAC. But interestingly enough, Ross, vendor questions from our conversations don't seem to be the areas where you commonly get the most questions about FERPA. So let's dig in there a little bit. What is on the mind of the folks who are calling that PTAC hotline and sending in their questions to PTAC?
Okay, so I think a common theme we hear are photos and videos. Now, granted, it's relatively newer guidance, came out in 2018. I mean, if I was giving a presentation in 2016, and you said, Ross, is a photograph an education record under FERPA, I would get really nervous. I'd throw down a smoke bomb and I'd probably escape out the back door because I didn't have a clear answer to it. Letter to Wachter in 2018 cleared a lot of it up. It's one of the sort of determination letters or guidance letters that the department released. It's really, really good. It's also written in a language I like to call FERPish, which isn't widely understood. So we translated it out of FERPish to English in photo video FAQ, which you see the link there. But generally what it says is that a video or photograph becomes an education record when it becomes directly related to a student. So it's very context specific, and it sort of depends on what happens in the video. And then there's some permutations there, because is it an education record of a single student, or is it an education record for multiple students? If it's an education record of multiple students, it gets complicated because you have to redact information or segregate it, or otherwise inform parents of the contents of that record. But fundamentally, like a lot of times school districts slip up here. They don't know all the rules. Like they get the question, kid gets kid gets hit on a school bus, and I want to see the school bus video. Sorry, we can't show it to you because of all the other kids on the school bus. Well, all the other kids on the school bus don't matter. It's only the kids involved in the incidents. And this is actually an area where, like, twice I've had to go, and actually, I'm sorry, 3 times I've requested video from my kids' schools. First time was, my daughter was getting bullied on the school bus. Older brother stood up for her, got punched by the bully. Now mind you, my kids don't know this, but if they ever got in trouble for getting into a fight for protecting their little sister or little brother or anybody else for that matter, they're not going to get in trouble from me. Odds are we're going out to ice cream afterwards. But I hear about it. I am like, shoot the email to the principal. I'd like to inspect and review this bus video, please. And then I waited and I waited and I waited. Took them like 40 days, and eventually they told me what happened in the video. They didn't know how to respond to the request, but they did inform me of what happened in the video, which technically is sufficient from a FERPA perspective. As a parent, may not have been entirely satisfied, but it met the requirements under the law. I had a second request that for a follow-up incident that happened a week later. They forgot about that one. So technically that would be a denial of access. Most recently, actually about 3 months ago, I had one of my kids was attacked in school, and I came in hot on that one. And I'm like, I want to inspect and review this video, and I'm like just waiting for them to say, sorry, we can't show this to you. And I was just go, bam, Google my name in FERPA and tell me that answer again. And the vice principal said, oh yeah, here you go, and just turned the laptop around and showed it to me, which was appreciative, but yeah, I lost a little bit of my thunder there. So typically when parents are requesting access to video, it's because something happened. They don't care about the FERPA. They don't care about privacy. They care that their kid is getting in trouble for something that they're not sure that they did. They care that their kid's not safe at school. So you need to keep those things in mind while you're handling these things. You do have avenues by which you can show it to everybody. You also have avenues where you can otherwise inform parents of the contents of that record. That's up to you on your policy. I would encourage you to have a policy and apply it consistently. But people get this wrong all the time. And a lot of times some of the advice that I give parents is here, ask the question again and send them a copy of this FAQ. Many, many times this allows them to actually kind of get to see what they need to see. But I am aware, I don't see the complaints that come in. I'm divorced from that side of the operation, so I can provide impartial technical assistance. I am aware of a lot of problems that have come up because of that are photo video related. So which of course lends itself to safety issues too, because the thing is, we have law enforcement units at school. A lot of times we have school resource officers. Unfortunately, school's not the safest, is necessarily safe as we want it to be in this day and age. So there are times where law enforcement needs to come in, whether it's an emergency or a school resource officer that's serving as a school official on behalf of the schools. Sometimes not everybody gets that stuff right. We get questions from police departments all the time, like, oh, we asked this student, asked the school if these students were in attendance that day, and they said they couldn't give it to us because of the FERPA. And I'm like, well, good, because you're not a school official. There's other exceptions that apply: subpoena, health and safety. School resource officers live in a sort of a special world as far as FERPA, kind of wearing two hats, wearing their police hat and wearing a school official hat. Just understand where the lines are. Train your school resource officers. Over my career, I've literally probably trained about 100,000 people on FERPA and I'm not exaggerating there. I can count on maybe two hands the number of school resource officers that have been in my sessions. When I give a FERPA 101 class, there's a pretest. Most audiences get 4 out of 10. Those are people that have received some kind of FERPA training before, and they're still getting most of it wrong. If you've never trained your school resource officer, you cannot be assured that they're going to get this stuff right. So having some, that FAQ that we have on our website is fantastic. We'd highly encourage you to review it if you haven't reviewed it already. But ultimately, a lot of the problems we see are just unforced errors. Don't be dumb.
And
There you go.
there we are. Let's talk a little bit about some of the unforced errors, because I think there's a really important takeaway here, which is that a lot of the friction between parents and education institutions when it comes to FERPA stems from, I think what we're hearing are safety issues, concern for physical safety, and in some cases knowledge gaps, and in some cases communication gaps. Right? So even if we are not an expert in FERPA, there are some common sense practices that we need to be aware of when it comes to protecting student data. And here I'm talking about, the data breaches that go wrong. And we could probably spend hours talking about how the communication in the aftermath of a breach makes it worse. In
Bad
many
news
cases,
doesn't get better over time.
no, it does not. And inaccurate news leads to trouble. Also doesn't stop the problem and doesn't get better over time. But I think we have many instances of we have many examples of a well-meaning employee accidentally sending data to the wrong person. I think, Ross, you had shared an example of reading assessments being posted on a wall. These are the unforced errors that we need to really be, can only prevent in many cases through education. And PTAC does provide FERPA training. There's an online module. There are short videos. And so for those teams, like your school resource officers, that maybe you don't get to in training, there are small pieces that you can start to send them to instill at least this understanding that this information is special. It needs special protection, it needs kid gloves, and not everyone gets to see it. And then consistently reminding your staffs, not just of FERPA. I find that training on the law only gets you so far. What we need to train on is, what are the behaviors we expect an individual to form in order to support the education institution's compliance with FERPA. And that's really where your training can be meaningful and have tremendous impact. Ross, I don't know if there's anything more that you wanted to share on this point.
So, I mean, I have 4 kids in the public school system. I can point to at least 10 or 11. I mean, I've literally lost track of the number of potential FERPA violations. I have never filed a complaint. My school district does a lot of things right. They train everybody on FERPA. They don't always get FERPA right. They actually even train the school resource officers, funny enough. I was at the Cub Scout meeting at the police department, and it was school resource officers that were giving the tour of the police department. And after the kids asked about, hey, have you ever been in a car chase or a gunfight or something? I asked, have you ever been trained on FERPA? And they said, yes. That's awesome. But it's a lot of it's simple things, and things that I use as training examples when I talk about it. I find when you're training privacy, relating it to the work that they do on a day-to-day basis. I'm a secretary. I have access to all this information. Like, okay, well, if you were sending the back to school letters on on students, then that's fine that you're accessing that. If you think Jennifer's dad, newly divorced dad is kind of kind of attractive, and you want to want his email address, probably not an appropriate use. But the thing is, there's there's 2 factors here, because there's I don't think my district is uncommon. Actually, I think my district probably has less of these little unforced errors than other districts, because many districts never give training on this at all. So you can imagine so all these problems at my district, and they give training, but if they've never gotten training, it's probably far worse. But most people don't know what to look for. So the second factor here is, what other things are going on? And typically, like, we'll see problems come up, and its connection to safety issues, its connection to disagreements about grades, or perhaps IEPs, what kind of interventions a student is getting. But there's usually some other conflict going on between the family and the school. And what I see often is FERPA becomes sort of their lever. Like, I'm having this problem with the school. I'm mad. I'm not getting what I want, or I feel that we're entitled to. I'm going to go latch onto this thing, and I'm going to stick it to the school. And so part of this, where I think school, and it's not even a privacy thing, where schools can improve is there's a certain customer service aspect of it, of dealing and interacting with parents. And I know that it is hard. And I know that a lot of educators are leaving the field because of dealing with parents. The last person that I brought onto PTAC, the 7 finalists for the position, 6 of them were educators leaving the practice, which is, as a parent of kids in school, that's somewhat terrifying that all the good, a lot of good teachers are leaving the field. But that's a subject of a different webinar. But if you just blow them off, it doesn't make it better. It winds up just agitating them. So, when, Lynette talks about transparency, I'm very, very big on transparency. Be open, upright, forthright, detail like what your student privacy practices are. Because if it's hard to find, they're just going to get more irate. There's a lot of easy things that you can do that ward off some of these problems. And also, I would argue at times might buy you a bit of grace as well when problems happen. Like I said, I've never filed a complaint. A couple times I've provided some free technical assistance. But especially when it's like two FERPA problems within an hour. But if things are going well, less people are less likely to take the time to go and seek to have some sort of enforcement action.
That's right. That's right. I think, there are a few notes here. One is, I think we appreciate that you actually are not given, you as technology leaders are not given time to train your teachers and train your employees. That is a common struggle. And yet we sit here and say, train everyone. And we appreciate that it's not that easy. But remember also that your training doesn't need to be a big hour-long sit and get LMS system, short videos, one sheets, anything that can grab attention, videotape your teachers giving the privacy tip of the day, whatever it is to get attention will help. And sometimes just keeping the training focused on what is the behavior I want someone to engage in? What is the behavior I want this admin to engage in when they are accessing reams of contact information? What is the behavior I want the teacher to engage in when they are handing out test papers? Those simple things can really go a long way to shoring up or starting to instill some awareness around privacy, much more so than here's a copy of FERPA or here's some FERPA training. I want you to read it. I want you to understand it. Obviously we want the FERPA training, but combine it with specific behavior training that's tailored to, for example, the athletic coach who has access to health information because he's taking the student with asthma on the road and needs to know what to do in case of an attack.
Well,
They
and
very well have not been
understanding,
given that training.
well, and also understanding some of, even outside of from a compliance perspective, some of those negative repercussions. So say like that athletic coach is mad about something because a student couldn't play that day, and they couldn't play because of some sort of sensitive medical issue, and he goes tells the whole team like, well, Johnny can't play because of X, Y, and Z, and it's it's some embarrassing medical issue. You could literally cause harm to a student, and that's something that I think people lose sight of, especially when you're just dealing with numbers and cells and fields inside of a student information system. All this information that we're collecting it's information about children. And I would argue
Absolutely.
most educators did not get into the business for the purpose of harming children, or at least I hope not.
Well, and privacy as a discipline is a very human-centered discipline. Privacy is not cybersecurity. Privacy is not technical controls. Although security supports privacy, privacy is really about giving, and it's certainly privacy in education. It focuses on this idea that individuals have a certain right to privacy, and an education institution exercises that right for students. And so you need to be thoughtful. You need to be human-centered. The student needs to be at the center of your decision about what you're going to do with their information, because you're effectively exercising their rights around their data. Not all of them, the parents have certain rights, but the decisions about what to collect, what to do with it, who to share it with, belong to you as an institution. And that's where the institution has a massive responsibility to do right by its student population when it comes to privacy.
Sure. Yeah.
And so privacy is not just about the spots and dots and the technical controls and the phishing training, but really instilling an awareness across the organization about the importance of expressing this individual right in a manner that is lawful, that is consistent, that is aligned with district policies and norms and community expectations in order to serve your student population and your community at large. And we so it's really it's culture change, it's change management, and so it requires your input as technology leaders. It requires your leadership input. We actually have at COSIN a resource that is a presentation deck. It's called Making the Case to Leadership. And it's a presentation deck. It's tailor-made, it's ready to go. You add your logo, you fill in a couple of slides of, what is it I want to ask my leadership for, and what do I want to ask my superintendent for, and you can use that to sit down and have the privacy conversation with your superintendent, to start because their input, their leadership is sorely needed in this work. This is not, as you know, a technology leader's responsibility alone. You may be in charge of a privacy program, but your leadership needs to be invested to implement, instill, provide the impetus for the change management that needs to happen across the world.
If
And
your
Ross, I know
leadership
that's
doesn't,
something you see a lot.
oh, sorry, if I was just to add in, if your leadership doesn't care about this, then your organization probably doesn't care about this. And typically leadership only cares about it after something bad happened, and then it is too late. So yeah, whatever you can do to get their attention. They don't have to be the ones coming up with all the policies and the procedures. Sometimes it is just as simple as showing up to a meeting.
That's right.
Their presence there conveys to the people below them that I consider this to be a priority. So that's, to the best that I don't envy you that. And I, from PTAC, we travel all the time. A lot of times when we train, we're teaching, we're talking to people like those positions like you're in right now. I think the reason you're here is you consider this to be important. We don't need to convince you that privacy and cybersecurity are important. What we really need is more leaders to listen in on some of this stuff before it's too late. It's because when you don't prioritize it, that's when the superintendent is the one that's having to send a mea culpa about a inadvertent disclosure, or they're the ones that are having to go and explain what happened with the data breach, or for the third data breach inside of 12 months. And sometimes there are repercussions for district leads. There are superintendents that have lost their jobs as part of sacrifice must be made for this privacy or security issue that's happened. So I mean, sometimes their jobs even depend on this.
That's right. The buck stops with the superintendent, and sometimes the work is communicating to the superintendent and reminding them that things are not all fine in the district's privacy program and security program, and that this is what you need in order to improve. And it is they are the ones with their hands, their face, their stakes in the game. We've said it a few times during this session: train. You cannot train too much, but do train correctly. Make sure that you are not overtraining to the point where people are bored with it. It doesn't need to be dry and dull. It can be funny, it can be silly. The important thing is to figure out what your message is and get that across in the way that your audience is going to respond to and the way that you are able to, given the constraints that you may have on available training time. And we've touched on this a bit, this idea that you're going to hear from your community when they're concerned, particularly about safety issues, or when there just isn't enough trust there. FERPA requires that you do a good deal of communication with your community. There's paperwork that needs to be sent home. There are forms that need to be sent home. But remember also that a pile of paperwork is not transparency and not communication. That's bureaucracy. So make sure that, one of the things you can do is read those forms that you're sending home with fresh eyes. Were they written by your legal counsel? Are they full of heretofores and herewith? And I always say, like, heretofore is not a word that people use. It's legal jargon. You can wash that clean. You can take that out. You can take what counsel provides you, refresh it in a way that you think your community will respond to, and ask your lawyer, is this enough? Is this good enough? I've said what you said, but I've used words that people more commonly converse around. And also sharing with your community. We instill this through the COSN's Trusted Learning Environment program. Being transparent about the work that you're doing on privacy. Do parents know what information you're collecting? Do they know what you do with it? Do they know the efforts that you're making to properly protect it? Because doing that can go a long way towards really changing the conversation in your district from this one of, sometimes adversarial relationships with parents to one that is more is built more on trust and understanding of really what's happening in the classroom, and how you are taking seriously your job in protecting their information.
What I say a lot is, in the absence of knowing what's going on with their student data, a lot of parents are just going to assume the worst. So be transparent. I would say with the paperwork that you're sending home, consider what paperwork that you send home. Put those of you who have kids in school, how much of the communication from that school are you actually reading and looking at? So we at PTAC, we recommend to strongly use your website as a central repository for this. A lot of people will put their annual notices like on, page 67 of board policy or page 99 of the parent handbook. I've never read the parent handbook. But if I care about FERPA, what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go to their website and I'm going to search for FERPA. So if on your website, make sure the search functionality works. Put all the FERPA stuff in one place. Really, really basic stuff. When I give a transparency presentation, I ask people just to go to their website and Google and search for FERPA. Many people are disappointed with what they find.
And we actually have at COSN part 3 of the privacy toolkit that I mentioned earlier is around trust and transparency and these communication tips. And one of the things we actually cite is a study that Department of Education did surveying district websites and seeing, who's leveraging their website for annual notices and disclosures and things of that sort, which doesn't exempt you from providing it in other ways, but your website is there. Standing up a page that speaks to how you protect student data privacy or what you do with student data, providing copies of the forms that you've sent home, those kinds of things, small things, can go a really long way to building trust in your community, because they're not digging for answers for those thorny questions they might have, that mistrust that might be kicking around in their brains. They can just go to your website and say, oh, okay. Sometimes when we see information on a website, it gives us the confidence to know that they know what they're doing. They've got it going on. If I don't see that information on the website that I expect to see there, I might think, are they not aware of their responsibilities? We do that with vendors. Parents do that with school districts. So remember that your website is there. And even if no one visits the page that you stood up, having it there is a really important and good thing to be able to point to. And your community will, those who are looking for it, will appreciate finding it there. And it's really speaks to this question of communicating properly and adequately with your community. A stack of paperwork is not communication, it's bureaucracy. And being respectful enough of your community to give them the information they need in the ways that are easily accessible can go a long way to bridging that trust gap. And then, of course, maintain control of your data. Review your data protection agreements. Make sure you have data protection agreements in place. Remember that when your teachers are clicking to agree, they are effectively signing a contract that is binding the district to certain practices. If no one has read those terms, if no one has put a data protection agreement in place with those free and low cost products that are so easy to bring into the classroom, that is just a big batch of risk that is a really important piece to speak to your superintendent about how do we start to mitigate that risk, narrow that swath of risk into something more manageable. Any closing thoughts for us, Ross, and any questions from our participants?
Well, we'll wait for some questions to come up in the chat, but I just, wanted to, obviously, thank COSIN for inviting me to this. We truly do value our partnership with COSIN. We are at PTAC, we are a resource. We're free. We are happy to help. Ask questions. We are available for speaking engagements as well. If there's a conference or something that you need content for, it's an option. Lynette helped me score one of our white whales. There's a state that we haven't been to as long as PTAC has been in existence, and we're finally going to be going there in 2 months, all because of Lynette. So thank you for that. Although if it's cold, then I'm going to blame you for it.
Of course.
But we are from, like I say, we're from the government. We're here to help.
Well, thank you so much, Ross, for being here today, for sharing your wisdom with our participants. We will make the slides available to you. COSIN will post the webinar. So for those of you here, if there's something you want to go back to, if you missed a URL, we will have it for you. Otherwise, I encourage you to visit studentprivacy.ed.gov. Lots of great free resources there, lots of training, lots of tips, lots of one sheets. And for COSIN, visit cosin.org/privacy or cosin.org/trusted, and you will find all of the COSIN resources that I've discussed here as well. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.